My name is Jillian Harper. I woke up in the hospital with 6 stitches in my scalp and my right wrist in a splint from a dislocation. The doctor said I fell down the stairs, but I remember very clearly the same hand that once steadied me as a toddler pushed me down last night. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. So why? And why, even as blood pooled across the marble floor, did no one call my name? Did no one stop me? Let me ask you something. Have you ever been pushed to the edges by your own family, then watched them rewrite the story to erase you from memory? If so, I'd like to hear about it below. And if you believe that sometimes justice arrives not through rage, but through silence and truth, leave a like, subscribe, and comment. Because the story I'm about to tell is unlike anything you've heard before. I remember the morning my mother died. The Seattle sky was gray, the same gray as her fading lungs, and the hospital room suddenly felt too large. When the nurse pulled the curtain closed, the heart monitor went silent, and I stood still for what felt like forever, just staring at her hand, limp, unmoving, the hand that once taught me how to hold a pencil, mend a tear, place thin apple slices into a cinnamon-laced pie. Everything that followed came in broken flashes, a walnut-colored casket, unfamiliar faces offering vague condolences, and my father, who didn't shed a tear. Only 4 months later, he brought a woman home, introduced her casually over dinner. This is Cynthia. She'll be dining with us tonight. I was 22, in my final year of software engineering, still living at the suburban house during breaks. Cynthia was beautiful in an almost unnatural way. Blonde hair set in perfect waves, gold-plated watch gleaming on her wrist, and a voice soft as whipped butter, but cold. Every movement felt rehearsed, down to the way she pulled out her chair or smiled politely at every empty conversation. I don't know how she did it, but within weeks, she moved in like the house had always been hers. The curtains were swapped for ivory lace, lavender replaced the cinnamon scent my mother loved, and the living room turned into a showroom. Gone were the nights of yarn and local news. Bit by bit, everything changed, and I began to learn silence. I did try to speak, politely, carefully, one evening when Cynthia suggested replacing all the family portraits with some anonymous oil paintings. I gently asked, "What about the photos of my mom and me?" She placed her wine glass down on the glass table, smiled gently, and said, "The dead deserve peace, Jillian. Good memories belong in your heart, not dangling in front of guests." I looked to my father, hoping he'd say something, but he only sipped his whiskey, eyes still fixed on the half-finished news report. His answer was always silence, the same silence that had crept in after my mother's funeral and settled over the house like a thin dust, making everything look familiar but feel like nothing was truly mine. Then Brandon arrived and everything shifted again, Cynthia's son from a previous marriage. He moved in after dropping out of college, again. Tall, smooth-talking, always in overpriced hoodies stamped with logos of startups I'd never heard of. He had this way of making jokes that were never just jokes, his eyes always watching, waiting to see if I'd overreact and prove him right. One night, as I talked about a new project at the software company, Cynthia suddenly cut in, laughing lightly. Jill's loved numbers and machines since she was little, always tinkering with something. A bit of an oddball in a family full of artists, right? She chuckled. Brandon chuckled. My father smirked, but I couldn't tell if it was amusement or discomfort. That's when I became the quirky engineer. At every event Cynthia hosted, I was introduced like an outsider. "Jillian does something with tech, smart girl," Cynthia once said, her tone as if describing a fancy toaster. "Not quite like the rest of us, but still valuable." Brandon, on the other hand, was always front and center, taken to networking mixers, photographed at charity events beside Cynthia, and even had access to a bank account my father had never let me near. "He's experimenting with a podcast concept," Cynthia would say proudly. Meanwhile, I quietly paid utility bills when they forgot or fixed the home's Wi-Fi every time it crashed. Never once thanked beyond a cursory nod. The house became a stage, Cynthia the director, Brandon the star, and me just the stagehand, present but never seen. Everything I did, from changing light bulbs to repairing the washer, was acknowledged with empty gratitude, if at all. When I landed a major contract at work and mentioned it at dinner, Cynthia gave a polite nod, then turned to Brandon. Darling, did you get any good engagement on your new video today? All eyes turned to him. Even my father's. I stopped bringing gifts home, stopped talking about work, stopped expecting anyone to ask me how I was. Once, after a delayed flight, I arrived late to the Christmas party and found my seat taken by some distant cousin. My father looked surprised. Oh, you made it? I smiled, unwound my scarf, and sat near the tree, where the lights didn't quite reach. Sometimes the most painful kind of abandonment doesn't come all at once. It happens quietly, through soft smiles, hollow well wishes, and glances that turn away just when they should meet yours. And I told myself, as long as I remained independent, I'd be fine. As long as I needed nothing from them, they couldn't hurt me. But I was wrong. Because even if you ask for nothing, there are people who will still take everything, just to make sure you're left with nothing. And I had no idea how close that moment really was. That night, it rained lightly, the kind of rain that shimmered like silver thread under the estate's driveway lights. I parked beneath the old maple tree near the porch, my fingers clenched tightly around my handbag. Brandon was throwing a launch party for his first book, a collage of photos and quotes, most of which were recycled. I didn't consider it a work, but Cynthia called it a pinnacle of creative perspective. Even my father nodded along, like Brandon had just discovered cold fusion. I hadn't planned to attend, but I wore a charcoal silk dress, a birthday gift from an old friend, just to avoid becoming the latest excuse for Cynthia to slander me behind closed doors. When I stepped inside, the living room had been transformed into a boutique gallery, with individually lit photographs, glass panels, and cedar-scented candles burning in expensive holders. A man in a tuxedo handed me a glass of wine and scanned me up and down. I gave a polite nod and moved past him. Brandon stood in the center of it all, arms around guests, smiling with such precision it made me question whether sincerity even existed anymore. Cynthia wore a deep red velvet gown, draped in pearls I once believed belonged to my mother, apparently now heirlooms of the new family. My father lingered at the bar, slowly stirring his bourbon, his gaze drifting across the crowd like he was an invited guest at a stranger's event. I scanned the sponsor list posted near the entrance. My name wasn't there. Not a single Jillian Harper in sight. Even though I'd wired over $30,000 into Brandon's account to cover printing, hosting, and lighting. When I'd asked him about it weeks earlier, Brandon texted back, "You know, your family, no need for credits." I hadn't replied. But standing there, staring at the printed names of donors, people who likely contributed a few $100s just to get a selfie with him, I felt something twist in my chest. At exactly 8 o'clock, Cynthia stepped onto the small stage, tapping her wine glass with a silver spoon. The lights dimmed. All eyes turned forward. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice echoing like a gallery welcome in Manhattan. "Brandon isn't just an artist. He's a voice for a new generation, and tonight we want to offer him something truly special." I furrowed my brow. "Please welcome Jillian Harper," Cynthia said, turning toward me with a lacquered smile. I froze, then made my way to the front, trying to steady my legs under the weight of so many watching eyes. No one said a word. Brandon stood on stage, curious. My father stayed in the back, holding his drink, unmoved. As I reached the stage, Cynthia gently placed her hand on my shoulder, almost lovingly. I hadn't yet grasped what was happening before she turned to the audience and said, clear as day, "We are so proud to announce that Jillian, the ever-generous sister, has decided to gift her Seattle home to Brandon so he can build his first creative studio. What a gesture of love, don't you think?" I stood there, stunned. The room thickened with tension. Someone chuckled quietly. Another guest gasped, "That's so generous." I turned to Cynthia. "I never agreed to that." She kept smiling. "Oh, Jillian, don't be modest. You always said you didn't need that much space. and Brandon really needs a place to create. That house is just sitting empty, right? No, I said firmly. It's not empty, and it's mine. Cynthia turned toward me, still smiling, but her eyes were no longer gentle. Jillian, she whispered softly, just enough for me to hear. Don't embarrass your family on such an important night. I didn't respond. I turned and stepped down from the stage, accompanied by confused murmurs from the crowd. A few guests gave me puzzled looks. A young woman whispered quietly, "Isn't she overreacting a bit?" I heard every word, each one cutting into my back. I made my way to the back staircase, my heart pounding as if about to burst. I needed air. I needed real light. But just as my foot touched the bottom step, Cynthia followed me. She called after me. Jillian, her voice was soft as a breeze, yet there was nothing gentle about it. I turned around, gripping the handrail tightly. Why did you do that? I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her expression calm and composed. You've always been an outsider, she said quietly, and outsiders rarely get to keep anything for long. Then, in that instant, without warning, Cynthia's hand pressed firmly against my shoulder and I felt a sudden, powerful shove. The stairs were slippery with moisture on the smooth stone surface. My heels slipped in a flash, lights swirled, my heartbeat caught midair, fell, and then everything sank into darkness. I woke to the sterile scent and bright white lights of a hospital. Everything blurred for several seconds, as if someone had wiped my memories clean with a damp cloth. The doctor told me I'd fallen down the last 3 stairs, hitting my head on the railing's edge, dislocating my wrist as I tried to grip the banister. But I knew I'd been pushed, not because I was paranoid, but because the last thing I saw before falling was Cynthia's eyes. And that wasn't the look of a stepmother. It was the gaze of someone who had just finished playing her part. I requested to be discharged the following morning. The nurse was surprised but didn't stop me, only gently reminding me to monitor any concussion symptoms for the next 36 hours. She softly asked if anyone was coming to pick me up. I shook my head. No one. Not a single text. Not from Brandon, not from my father, and certainly not from Cynthia. I called an Uber and sat silently in the back seat like a ghost in my hospital gown. Not ready to go home yet, I stopped by a small cafe near Pike Place, a place my mother and I used to visit every weekend afternoon. I ordered a cup of ginger tea, my hands still trembling. When I checked my phone, the screen lit up with over 40 notifications from social media apps. The same link repeatedly pasted, accompanied by pointing finger emojis and exclamation marks. I clicked. It was a clip from the party, posted on a YouTube channel called Brandon Creative, with more than 20,000 subscribers. The title, printed boldly, read, "When My Paranoid Sister Ruined the Biggest Night of My Life." The thumbnail showed my face twisted in anger, frozen at the moment I shouted, "I never agreed to that!" The surrounding light was dim, Brandon's face clearly visible behind me, his wounded eyes making him appear as the victim. I heard my own voice in the video, distorted, clumsily edited. Faint laughter was inserted in the background. Comments underneath cut like knives. Drama queen. Typical jealous sister. Brandon deserves better. One account wrote bluntly, "She should be erased from the family tree." I shut off the video, my heart pounding so violently it felt like it would break apart. I opened my email, desperate for reason. In my inbox, I found a notification from my apartment's security system. Access denied. Smart lock system disconnected. I opened the remote control app. Logged out. When I tried to log back in, the screen read, "Account no longer exists." I called the building reception. An unfamiliar male voice answered, "Ms. Harper? Apartment 12B has recently had its ownership updated under a property transfer authorization dated the 6th of this month. You're no longer listed as a resident." I froze. "I never signed anything," I said, voice choking. "Can you send me a copy of the documents?" "I'm sorry," he replied, "but since your name is no longer on the record, I can't provide that information." I hung up, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I'd been erased. Not just physically, but completely wiped from the home I'd bought myself, from the collective memories my family created, even from the truth itself. I broke down crying right there in the cafe, not loudly, just quiet, endless tears that wouldn't stop. The barista quietly handed me some tissues, her eyes sympathetic, but asked no questions. I texted Brandon, "What the hell are you doing?" No reply. I texted again, "Why did you post that clip? Why are you taking my home?" No reply. I called my father. The phone rang and then went to voicemail. I left a message. "I've been locked out of my apartment, locked out of my account. Do you know what they're doing?" No one answered. I checked my phone again, desperately scanning every stored email, every document related to my apartment, purchase agreements, tax records, mortgage contracts. I still had the original PDFs, my signature clear as day. Yet the last email from the bank stated, "We confirm completion of property transfer to new owner, Brandon Harper, as per the valid documentation submitted." Below that was my digital signature, forged. I felt myself slowly sinking, as if an invisible hand was pulling me under, inch by inch. My assets gone. My reputation slandered. My family turned their backs. Social media making me look insane. Outside, a soft rain continued falling, but inside me, a storm raged. And at the center of it, I knew I had nothing left to lose. I sat quietly in the temporary room I rented on Capitol Hill, the breeze gently moving the thin cotton curtain from the half-opened window. My laptop screen displayed an email reply from the county registrar's office, a fancy way of refusing any further information to a person no longer listed as the property owner. The dim light from a small desk lamp darkened the bruises on my wrist, reminding me clearly of what happened and what I was now facing. My phone rang, an unknown number, San Francisco area code. I almost didn't answer, but something in me instinctively swiped to pick it up. "Jillian?" Hesitated. The voice was familiar, deep, slightly husky, yet warm beneath each word. "Who's this?" "It's Noah Sullivan, from high school, MS Fletcher's literature class." I paused, sorting through my tangled memories. Even amidst the chaos, I remembered the voice clearly. The boy who sat beside me in class, carefully taking notes line by line, laughing quietly whenever I had to read poetry aloud. "Oh my God," I breathed. "How did you—" "I saw Brendan's video," he said gently, and I immediately knew something wasn't right. I stayed silent, the quiet stretched like an old scar reopening. Noah continued, "I work in civil rights and property law. Your story, it's not uncommon, but the way they're doing it, it's crueler than most." An hour later, we met at a small cafe in Fremont, where the afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows, casting pale, golden shapes on the old tile floor. Noah walked in, taller than I remembered, his hair neatly trimmed, wearing a simple white shirt under a charcoal blazer. But his eyes, the same ones I remembered clearly at 18, were steady and observant. "I want to help," he said after a few polite exchanges. "I can't afford much," I replied, eyes fixed on my steaming tea. "I don't charge people who once helped me pass senior year math," he smiled gently. "And this isn't about returning favors, it's about what's right." We started that very night. I sent Noah all the documents I had left, the purchase agreements, real estate tax statements, email correspondence with the bank, and photos of my actual signature from various notarized documents. Noah didn't say much, just nodded continuously, fingers scrolling through each page as though assembling a roadmap. "The first mistake," he said, "is that they forged your digital signature without matching it to your physical signature. Washington's digital notary system requires two-factor authentication via OTP codes, and they used a compromised email account." "My email?" I asked, leaning toward the screen. Noah nodded. "They used information from an old login of yours on an unfamiliar device, most likely from within your own home." My neck felt ice cold. "Maybe when I used my laptop at my father's house." Noah didn't need me to finish. I think so. For the next 3 days, we worked as if nothing else existed but the truth. Noah traced IP addresses, asked colleagues from cybersecurity to help examine electronic notary data, and tracked down the lawyer's office that notarized the contract. This name looks familiar, Noah said, staring at the representative's name. Deborah Lynn? She used to work with Cynthia when they both were part of the city's real estate brokerage. I looked up. Cynthia used to work in real estate? For nearly 10 years. She stopped about 3 years ago. There were multiple incidents involving altered property documents, but none were prosecuted because victims lacked sufficient evidence. It seems she was skilled at making everything appear legitimate. The air in the room thickened. My skin felt chilled. Noah opened another file. Here, it's an old file related to your father. Glenn Harper. 3 years ago, he sold a small property in Spokane with Cynthia acting as the representative. But here's the problem. That property was under the joint ownership of him and his first wife, your mother. I gripped the armrest, lips pressed tightly. They sold it without ever mentioning my mother's share? Noah nodded. I think you're standing on an iceberg they assumed had melted away. I closed my eyes, feeling everything I'd once suspected was no longer just paranoia. It was proof, something tangible, visible, and ready to be presented before a judge. Noah looked at me, his eyes softening. Do you want me to keep going? Because if we do, there's no turning back. I nodded, without hesitation. I returned to the house late on a Thursday night, rain softly drizzling on the porch roof, neighbors' lights already dimming. The iron gate still made its familiar creaking sound each time it opened, even though Cynthia had bragged about having someone regularly oil it to keep everything perfect. I carried an empty bag, claiming I was there to retrieve personal belongings left behind in my old room. Cynthia wasn't home. She sent me a brief message. Spare key is in the mailbox, as usual. Go quickly, take what you need, and don't disturb anyone. I didn't reply. Inside, everything was oddly quiet. No TV sound, no jazz music, no cedar-scented candles. The polished wooden floor was so reflective that the wall lights made me feel like I was walking on mirrors. The living room remained exactly as during the previous party. Artificial flowers arranged high on shelves, a large portrait of Brandon prominently displayed over the fireplace. None of my mother. I hurried upstairs, pretending to check the old desk drawer. Inside were just a few unused notebooks and a box of plastic rings from high school. I gently lifted the velvet lining at the bottom. Nothing. But I wasn't there for memories. The basement was a place Cynthia had forbidden me to enter. She called it the private area, claiming it stored important family financial documents, and I had no reason to be down there. Actually, it had been my mother's office when she was alive. A room filled with handwritten manuscripts, medical records, and folders detailing every treatment and penny saved for me. I descended the small wooden staircase near the laundry room. Dim yellow light spilled from an old bulb hanging from the ceiling, making the space feel like a vintage wine cellar. I moved along the wall, fingers brushing dusty shelves, until I stopped in front of a locked iron cabinet. A safe. It had a traditional mechanical combination lock, no electronic keypad, but beneath it, in a small drawer, I found a thin notebook with a worn spine. Opening it, I wasn't surprised to see several combinations, series of 3 numbers, scribbled lightly in pencil. I tried the first combination, wrong. I tried the second, there was a quiet click that sent shivers down my spine. The heavy iron door slowly swung open. Inside were 3 thick file folders, neatly stacked, the topmost a black plastic cover labeled Jillian H. Records. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it out. Opening the first page, I saw a bolded psychiatric evaluation. Subject exhibits mild paranoid tendencies. Signs of emotional instability. Recommended for further monitoring. Signed by a psychologist I'd never met. Below it was a summary of treatment at a rehabilitation facility, one I'd never even set foot in. I stopped at the 3rd page, heart pounding, a handwritten note between pages, clearly Cynthia's handwriting. If needed, print from hard drive and pass to Deborah for handling. I bit my lip, hard. They had prepared fake psychiatric records for me. Maybe to discredit me if I reacted, maybe to use against me if I dared sue. Everything had been carefully planned. The second folder was thicker. It was my mother's life insurance policy. On the first page was her name, birth date, policy date, and insurer. The original beneficiary was marked clearly in blue pen, Jillian Harper. But that line had been crossed out in black ink, replaced by Glenn Harper and current spouse. Below was a faint notarization stamp. I held the paper under the light. The stamp was smudged, the date clearly altered. The margin showed small tears, as if attached pages had been removed. I swallowed painfully. They hadn't just erased me from the present. They'd erased me from my mother's legacy as well. The last folder froze me in place. It was a leather-bound notebook, similar to the one my mother used to track expenses, but not in her handwriting, it was mine. Or rather, an imitation of my signature. Inside were meticulous records of numerous fund transfers, from the account titled Jillian H. Harper to home repairs, Brandon's tuition, family vacations, church contributions, listed over the past 6 years, supposedly voluntary, with no signatures except one final note. Fixed authorization, no monthly confirmation required. I had no memory of signing anything like that. Yet the ledger detailed each date, each amount. Attached were printed bank statements, complete, clear. I stepped back, my hands ice cold. Old words echoed clearly in my mind. Julian's always private, overly independent. She's a little odd. Don't fully trust her. Those words, it turned out, were intended to make it easier to believe I was unstable. I pulled out my phone, switched it to silent, and photographed each page. Every line, every number, every handwritten note. Once done, I carefully returned everything exactly as it was, locked the safe, and straightened the curtain covering it. Every trace of my presence I preserved in images. As for this house, I left it exactly as it had treated me, without a single footprint. I left the basement without turning on any lights. Before stepping out the door, I turned around to look at the house one last time. No sound, no people, no family warmth, just emptiness, polished over with cold courtesy. And then I stepped into the night, not trembling, not looking back, carrying evidence of an entire betrayal, calculated down to the smallest detail. 3 days after the night I left that house with the evidence in my bag, Noah filed a lawsuit with the King County Court. Each item in the case file was written in cold but precise language. Financial abuse, property fraud, physical assault, forgery of notarized documents. He attached all the photographed documents I had gathered, handwriting analyses by experts, and footage extracted from a neighbor's backyard security camera, dimly capturing the moment I stumbled down the stairs after being pushed. The court responded faster than I expected, perhaps because the evidence was so clear, or perhaps because something in the file made them realize this was no longer just a small family dispute. A temporary restraining order was issued, freezing the mansion where Cynthia and Brandon lived, accompanied by a warning prohibiting any transactions, transfers, or interference with any assets related to the ongoing case. That evening, I received a text message from an old friend. "Did you watch Brandon's clip?" I hadn't, but after that question, I already knew. I opened social media and didn't have to search long. On screen was Brandon's face, dim lighting, the camera shaking slightly from handheld recording. He sat in the living room, with an old photo of him and Cynthia behind, portraying a perfect family. Brandon's eyes were red, his voice choked up between sentences. "I don't understand why my sister chose this path. We were a family. This house is where I grew up. Now she's suing us to take it back, to throw us onto the street. I don't get it. All we've ever done is try to live well." I watched half the clip, then stopped. Not because I couldn't handle it, but because I knew it wasn't meant for me. It was for outsiders, audiences who didn't know what happened behind closed doors, people who are swayed by emotion rather than truth. Comments under the video overflowed with support for Brandon. "I can't believe she could be that heartless. That house belonged to their parents, not just her. I hope Brandon gets through this shock." But Noah had prepared, and so had I. The next day, I uploaded copies of documents into a public Dropbox account. No captions, no anger, just a folder titled Truth If You Care. Inside were 3 files. Bank statements showing forged signatures matching Cynthia's handwriting. Internal emails between Brandon and Deborah Lynn discussing adjusting ownership records to fit the situation. Certified digital signature records from the authentication company proving my signature on the transfer documents was forged. Included was a voice recording of Cynthia speaking to someone on a call I accidentally recorded when she thought I'd left. She won't do anything. She's weak. At most, she'll cry a few days, then disappear, just like always. 2 hours after I posted that folder, Noah called. They deleted the video, he said, and their lawyer just contacted my office. I stayed silent. I didn't ask further. I simply gazed out the window of my small apartment, watching maple branches gently sway in the early breeze. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. That afternoon, a small article appeared in the Seattle Times legal section. Former real estate agent accused of financial abuse and forging documents to seize property from stepchild. They didn't use my name, just the plaintiff whose identity is withheld for legal reasons. But I didn't need my name there. I only needed the truth told. And I knew this was just the beginning. I received a letter from an unfamiliar address in Bellingham, handwritten on pale yellow paper, sturdy yet gracefully curved handwriting, the type belonging to someone who learned calligraphy before typewriters became common. At the top was clearly written, "To Jillian Harper, we need to talk." Below was the name that stopped me in my tracks for a few seconds. Margaret A. Harper. My grandmother. I hadn't heard that name in nearly 10 years. After my mother's funeral, she'd come briefly, then disappeared from our family life, as if by her own choice. Cynthia once said, "She doesn't want to get caught up in our mess." Back then, I was too naive to doubt it, but now I saw clearly. No grandmother chooses to withdraw from her grandchild unless forced to. I drove to Bellingham that weekend, passing quiet roads along lake shores, maple leaves carpeting the sidewalks, old wooden houses still hanging summer lights despite autumn's arrival. Margaret lived in a small 2-story house with a sloped roof, white painted walls, mint green window frames. When I stepped onto the porch, the door was already open. She stood there, thinner than I remembered, but her gaze just as steady. The same eyes that had watched me patiently when I spilled milk on my new Christmas dress at 8 years old. No embrace. She only tilted her head, saying, "You've come at the right time. I was just brewing tea." In the small, warm kitchen, fragrant with almond cookies, she poured tea into 2 blue ceramic cups and pushed one toward me. She didn't ask about the family. She showed no pity. She simply took out a small wooden box, opened by a silver key hanging from her necklace. "I've kept this for 14 years, she said. "Never thought you'd actually need it." Inside was a black-inked will, notarized, and a handwritten letter. I flipped open the first page. Testator, Rachel V. Harper. My mother's name. In the will, I, Jillian Harper, was named the sole heir of my mother's estate, including ownership of her portion of the Spokane house, a savings account opened under my name before I was 3, and a life insurance payout after her death. Yet I had never known about these things, never received a cent, because all of it, according to tax records, had been merged into marital assets with the consent of my legal guardian, my father, Glenn Harper. I looked at her. Why only now? She held my gaze steadily. "Because Cynthia forced your father to cut off contact. I tried calling, sending letters, but no one responded. I had no legal right to intervene when they transferred assets. But I kept the original, because something told me someday you'd need it." I didn't say a word. I simply nodded softly, my hands gripping the will tightly, holding on to something real, something I'd believed was lost forever. That night, I sent a scanned copy to Noah. He called back almost immediately. This changes everything, Jillian, he said. If the will is validated, all subsequent transfers can be deemed violations of the testor's intentions. And with evidence of misuse of guardianship, we can petition the court to reconsider the entire misappropriated estate. That means we're not just talking about the old house or the seized apartment, he said, but the full value of your mother's estate, including the life insurance settlement. If Cynthia and Glenn misappropriated or sold it, they could face prosecution. I sat silently for a moment, not from fear, but because for the first time I felt I was no longer standing in the shadows. The next morning, I stepped out of my rented apartment wearing a long coat, my hair tied back neatly. Outside the local press office, two young reporters were smoking, waiting for a figure in another lawsuit to arrive. I walked straight to the reception desk and left copies of the will, the forged signature analysis, the fake medical records, and Cynthia's handwritten letter I had found that night in the file. I didn't say much, I just left a note. This is the truth, write whatever you want, but write it right. 3 days later, an investigative article appeared on the front page. Software engineer Sue's family erased from the estate, diagnosed with mental illness and a rebellion born from a cup of tea. They didn't portray me as a victim. They wrote me as a survivor. I began speaking out on social media, at legal press conferences, in news articles. I told the story not to accuse, but to prove. Silence is not consent. I was no longer the faint sister standing behind closed doors, no longer the woman labeled unstable for daring to claim what was mine. The verdict was announced on a sunny early winter morning as soft rays filtered through the courtroom's large windows and landed on my coat like an end to a chapter. The judge read each clause aloud, clear and concise, like a cold but fair summary. I felt no joy, no tears, just a slow breath, as if my body had been waiting for that moment so long it had no energy left to react. I was restored ownership of my apartment in Seattle. The court ordered the defendants, Glenn Harper and Cynthia Harper, to return all unlawfully transferred assets, including my mother's inheritance, the value of the wrongfully sold house, and compensation for emotional damages caused by the forged medical records. The amount was enough for me to start fresh anywhere. But what brought me peace was the final line in the judgment. Transfer case to criminal investigation under Section 9 for organized property fraud. Noah lightly placed his hand on my shoulder as we left the courtroom. No words were spoken. He understood I didn't need congratulations. He simply walked beside me, as he had throughout this journey, not imposing, not shielding, just present when I needed him. The news spread faster than I expected. The next day, Brandon posted a short video titled, "I Was Betrayed." He spoke at length, eyes red, clutching his book tightly, voice choked. I don't know what my mom did, I'm just a kid caught in grown-up games. But just 1 day later, the publisher sent a notice to terminate their contract. They didn't want to be involved in what the public called the Harper family drama of the century. Cynthia vanished from social media platforms. On a real estate forum, people discussed her former company severing ties right after the investigative article was published. Some former colleagues left comments, not surprised, always felt something was off, master of the perfect disguise. I didn't react, didn't share, didn't comment. I turned off notifications from all social platforms. I wanted to withdraw from that cycle, where people applaud you today and forget you by tomorrow morning. 3 weeks later, I left Seattle. No farewell, no notice. I rented a small house near Cannon Beach, Oregon, where ocean waves rhythmically lap the sandy shore and the salty breeze slips through every crack. The 2-bedroom wooden house with a pitched roof had a backyard big enough for me to plant some lavender and set up a chaise lounge for afternoon reading. I started over with simple things, waking early, brewing coffee, opening windows to let light and wind fill the room. Afternoons were spent at the beach, walking for hours along the shore, letting soft sand underfoot wash away the lingering aches from the long fight. Nights, I sat in the small living room, playing soft music and writing notes for something unnamed, not memoirs, not autobiography, just lines of memory, laid down so they wouldn't nestle in my chest anymore. My neighbors were an elderly couple, Marion and George. They didn't ask much, just nodded hello when they saw me in the garden, sometimes bringing over a tray of apple pie or some fresh basil picked from their backyard. Kindness needs no explanation. It exists like air, and I was grateful for it. One morning, I received a handwritten letter, a cream envelope with slanted script. It was from my grandmother, Margaret. Dear Jillian, I heard you moved away. Good. You need a place free from toxic memories. If you can, keep yourself at peace. Don't carry them, even in your dreams. I folded the letter, set it on the table beside a cup of chamomile tea. I didn't cry, but something inside softened, lightened. I don't hate Cynthia, nor do I regret speaking out. I just no longer have room in my heart for those who once treated me like a doormat they could trample on to keep their shoes clean. Freedom is not a moment. It's a series of silent choices. It's each day passing without being weighed down by others' expectations, without doubting myself, without needing to prove I'm worthy of anything. That afternoon, the wind blew stronger than usual. I had just brewed a pot of peppermint tea when I heard the mail truck stop at the gate. The old mailman nodded quietly, said nothing, and placed a package on the doorstep. I stepped outside, bent down, and picked up the small, brown-wrapped box, heavy, with no sender's name, only a short handwritten line, Jillian Harper, personal. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My father's handwriting, slender, blocky, just like the notes he used to write and stick on the fridge, reminding me to change light bulbs, take out the trash, or don't let the cat climb on the dinner table. I hadn't seen anything written just for me in 15 years, since Mom passed away. I brought the package inside, carefully cut the tape. Inside was a folded letter, no heading, no date. Just one sentence, written in blue ink. Jillian, I've left you alone too long. I'm sorry. Nothing more, no explanation, no confession, no pleading. Just 8 words, but each one felt like a late stitch closing a scar that had long hardened. I folded the letter, no tears, no anger. I just opened the drawer below the bookshelf and took out the old wooden box I'd carried with me throughout this journey, the keepsake box my mother had given me. I rummaged through a few tiny things, an old wristwatch that no longer worked, the empty bottle of jasmine perfume she used to wear, a dark red ribbon that once tied my hair when I was about 10. Then I saw the photo. It was me, about 7 or 8 years old, wearing an ivory silk dress, my hair tied unevenly on both sides, bending over the dining table, carefully fixing a folded swan-shaped napkin. Behind me, people were laughing and talking, the party lively, but I wasn't looking at them. I was focused only on the napkin. The photo was taken from the side. No one noticed me. No one stood beside me. Just a child carefully folding something the adults didn't bother to arrange neatly. I held the photo and smiled, not bitterly, not pityingly, but like meeting myself again. The little girl who thought that if the napkin was beautiful enough, someone might stay beside her just a little longer. I placed the photo on the small kitchen table where I sit every evening, alone or sometimes with Marianne and George visiting. I pulled a napkin from the drawer and began folding it, not into a swan shape like before, but something simpler, rounder, and softer. I placed it in the center of the table, next to a cup of tea and the crumbs left from breakfast. No one needed to sit with me to make me feel worthy. I didn't need comfort. I didn't need anyone defending me at a party. I had built my own table where no one was invited if they came just to take up space. Outside the window, the ocean continued its steady rhythm. Far away, seagulls glided against the pale gray sky. Nothing special, no drama, just silence, big enough to make you understand. Quiet can be an answer too. I put my father's letter back into the envelope, then tucked it into the bottom drawer, not to forget, but to remind myself that some apologies don't need a response, yet are still worth keeping. I live simply. Every morning I brew tea. Every afternoon I read. Every night I light candles when it's cold. I no longer seek to explain the past, nor do I let anyone make me feel like I need to prove I'm good enough. I am enough. No need to stand at a party, no need to be introduced, no need for a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. Just a private space, a neatly folded napkin, and the stillness that I create, protect, and no one can take away. I don't know if my story reminds you of something from your life. Maybe a party where you were forgotten, a house you once thought you belonged to, or simply a moment when you realized silence is not weakness, but the first step toward freedom. If you've ever had to walk away from those who share your name, I hope you share your feelings below. I truly want to know, how did you get through it? What did you hold on to? And what did you let go of? To keep living peacefully. And if you want to listen with me to more stories about family, forgiveness, and how we find ourselves again after the cracks, don't forget to follow the channel, because life still has many stories waiting to be told. And maybe, somewhere among those stories, you'll find yourself.